Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel and podcast. Today I'm going to have my final talk about Jesus' rejection at Nazareth, and I'm going to turn to a different topic about it. The last couple of weeks I've been talking about whether this type of thing happened twice, at least to him, or whether there was just one rejection at Nazareth. I've been coming down on the side of saying that something broadly similar happened twice. Today I'm going to move to something rather different about the rejection. I've been previously talking about Mark's and Matthew's versions together because I believe they're telling about the same incident, and then contrasting those with Luke's, with the question being, did Luke kind of make something up or dischronologically move the same event? And so I've been saying, no, they're different. But today I want to talk about a point of difference between Matthew and Mark. Now, there's a footnote that I've read several times on this channel. I'm not going to read it today. I'm just going to refer to it from Dale Allison's book on Jesus' resurrection. And it's just a very striking footnote. He's extremely negative about people who harmonize the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection. He particularly mentions Jake O'Donnell and John Wenham, and mentions the fact that they're inerrantists and engages in what is really an ad hominem. He dismisses their harmonizations on the grounds that these are just motivated by a certain view of inspiration, which he said was destroyed or some such word by the deists. And that's, that's pretty bad tone. It's also not a good argument. But I want to focus here on part of that footnote where he says something like, it is as though the successes of redaction criticism in attributing certain gospel redactions to the evangelists' agendas were an illusion. So, all this harmonization that Wenham and others are undertaking is as though they are unaware of what he just declares to be the successes of redaction criticism at attributing these things to the different authors' agendas. Well, I'm just going to seize the bull by the horns there and say, yes, that is an illusion. There aren't successes of this kind. In fact, I said on Facebook recently that all developmental theses about the Gospels, where, it starts this way and then it gets more and more and more this other way, all of those are bunk. B-U-N-K, bunk. I have never seen a developmental thesis that is defensible when all evidence is taken into account. They're all cherry-picked. The Gospels become slowly and gradually more high in their Christology. The Gospels become slowly and gradually more anti-Semitic, progressively more. The Gospels progressively attribute more conflicts between Jesus and the Pharisees. I've seen that one. Not true. So those are all wrong. And a larger theme here has been that it's not just an anti-supernatural bias that is a problem in New Testament studies. If anything, it's these other weird biases, like a bias in favor of gradual development sequences, or a bias against multiple events of broadly the same kind. So this idea that Matthew, in particular, is redacting Mark in line with higher Christology, very common in critical scholarship. It's one of those supposed successes, that we wouldn't want to say is an illusion, but I would say is an illusion. So in Matthew's and Mark's stories of this same rejection at Nazareth, we have one of these alleged redactions. So Mark 6:5, toward the end of this little incident, and he could do no miracle there except that he laid his hands upon a few sick people and healed them, and he wondered at their unbelief. That's Mark 6, 5, and 6. All right. Now we go to Matthew telling about the same incident, Matthew 13, 58. And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. Now, I kid you not, it's a thing that scholars will say that Matthew is looking at Mark and he's saying, well, I don't want to say he could do no miracles there except, no, I want to soften that to he did not do many miracles there, okay? Because to say that Jesus could not do many miracles is like attributing a lack of power to Jesus, and that, you know, Matthew's supposedly uncomfortable with that. So this is supposed to be part of that whole idea of redaction in the service of an agenda. If I recall correctly, there's also a place where Mark has that even the Son does not know the day or the hour of his return, and that Matthew just drops that when he gives that same section. So that's supposed to be part of this same pattern. Now, I would note just to begin with that the external facts being reported here are exactly the same. Okay, so Mark doesn't say that he couldn't do absolutely any. He says he couldn't do any except. So Mark says that Jesus did do some miracles. And Matthew just says he did not do many. So, I mean, they're actually agreeing, okay, that he did some. And they're also agreeing that there was something about the unbelief of the people that was causally connected to the relatively small number of healings that Jesus did. Now, I'm not going to get into the theological question, you know, was Jesus literally unable, or is it a different kind of could not, as narrated in Mark? In fact, we don't even know what led Mark to say this. You know, did Jesus make some comment to his disciples, like, I would do more miracles here, but they're so unbelieving that I can't, or something like that. Can't bring myself to, I'm not able, whatever. Or was that a conjecture on the part of the disciples? We don't really know. But to begin with, we can really see an agreement here in what they're narrating, the external facts. Now, the other thing is, I think we should question this idea of, you know, Matthew poring over Mark and every tiny little difference. Like, I'm going to substitute a synonym there, and I'm going to tweak those words just a tiny bit there. It's such a deliberate process. And I think especially with the unwieldiness of scrolls and just the naturalness of giving something somewhat more in your own words, right away, we should be suspicious. There's quite a burden of proof here that I think critical scholars don't recognize when they want to claim that there's some heavy motivation for a very small wording difference of this kind. But more than that, this whole idea that Mark and Matthew have different Christologies, and that Matthew is editing Mark in this very self-conscious fashion in the service of a higher Christology, is subject to counterexample. And this shows how these developmental theses are always, I can't think of a single exception, they are always based on cherry picking, where you pick out certain things and you go, ooh, you know, that looks like a development. And then you leave out other things that don't fit with that thesis of development. So some of the evidence that is against this thesis of a gradually higher Christology in Matthew than in Mark is just the material that they both include. So, for example, they both include Jesus claimed to be able to forgive sins, and the fact that the leaders consider this to be a divine prerogative, and that Jesus doubles down, you know, in the healing of the paralytic and says, you know, yeah, I do have power on earth to forgive sins. Okay, that's in both. It's in both Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark. There's no sign of, Mark having the lower Christology and Matthew raising it by redacting him. They both have Jesus' agony in the garden where he says, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Again, this could be regarded as a sign of a lower Christology, that there could be a difference between Jesus' will and the will of the Father. Matthew doesn't shy away from that. Matthew includes that as well. You see how this works? They both have Jesus cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which again, could be regarded as, offensive to Matthew if Matthew's goal is to redact Mark in service of a higher Christology than Mark's. He could have just left that out. So a lot of the common material, either showing Jesus to be human and in some, mysterious fashion to be the Father's representative, but also to have a will, to be able to say, not my will, but yours be done, that's there. And then on the other hand, for Mark to recognize that he has the power to forgive sins, and then of course Matthew has that as well. So on both sides of that, the common material argues against a development. But there's another argument that is a real counterexample to this. If you look at Mark 14, he's talking about Jesus before the Sanhedrin. And Mark 14:61 says, again the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. So that's Mark 14:61 through approximately 64. Now, if you just grab Greek text analysis and have a look at verse 62, when Jesus answers that question, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? In Mark, he says, I am, just as it's translated, ego, and it's ego eimi. Now, they might very well have been speaking Aramaic among themselves, but in the Greek, it's ego eimi, and actually, if that's literally what he said, or some literal translation of it in Aramaic, that makes it even more understandable that the high priest tears his clothes and accuses him of blasphemy, because that sounds like a claim to deity. May or may not be how they took it, but certainly it's a striking thing, and I think it's one of the strongest things. I'm surprised I don't hear it mentioned more often when people will say, oh, there are I am sayings in the synoptics, though maybe Jesus is on the water and he says, do not be afraid, it is I. That one seems to me weaker than this one, because here he's actually being asked directly about his identity and who he is, and they're immediately claiming it's blasphemy and so forth, and he says, I am. That's in Mark. Now, look at Matthew. Okay. I gotta get the right passage here. We're over here in Matthew chapter 27, same incident. Okay. It's being questioned. Matthew 26. Matthew 26, verse 63. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said it. And the NASB has yourself. I mean, like that isn't in the Greek, but you have said it. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robe, saying, he is blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. Very same scene. But when the high priest asks him, the Greek in Matthew has, it's a su ipos, you have said. Very similar to what Jesus says to Pilate in Luke, are you the king of the Jews? You said it, And I think that this is linguistically indicative, by the way, that you say it or you said it could just be a yes. It could just be taken as an affirmative. But the point is that Matthew's wording there, if he's redacting Mark, contains something that sounds less potentially blasphemous, like a less of a high claim to deity than the wording in Mark. So if we're picturing Matthew as engaging in this redaction in the service of a higher Christology, this is going in exactly the opposite direction. I think there can be no doubt. If the verse there, which really occurs in Mark, occurred in Matthew, and the verse that occurs in Matthew occurred in Mark, if it were reversed, this would for sure be listed as part of this success of redaction criticism at attributing the changes and the differences in the Gospels to Matthew's agenda of a higher Christology. For sure it would. I think any honest person should admit that once you look into this. But it's not. It's the other way around. The ego eimi is in Mark, and the you have said it is in Matthew. So I think that's an illustration of how these developmental theses take on a life of their own. They're so attractive to scholars that they get used by cherry-picking data and by ignoring contrary data. And since I was talking about the rejection at Nazareth, and I even mentioned the place where it said he couldn't do many miracles, when talking about whether it occurred once or twice that he was rejected, I figured I'd better pause and mention this. Now, as I continue, next week I might be doing more talking about developmental theses, because that's definitely one of those biases that is not per se a bias against the supernatural, but that sort of captivates the scholarly mind and is bad for clear reasoning about the Gospels. It's a failure to recognize sort of the randomness of the variants that we get, which is a lot more like witness testimony than it is like carefully constructed religious literature with an agenda. So I think that might make a good theme for me to continue with as I go on. But this wraps up the short series on Jesus' rejection at Nazareth. Come back next time. Please like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.